Hello, welcome back. Gonna do a little quick one here, waiting on the Sunday morning. Gonna go have lunch with the wife here in a little bit. Get a little bit of time to kill. And I wanted to talk about influences, okay? When you first start playing, you are influenced by everything that you've listened to or that you are listening to, right? Influenced in the sense that that's what you want to play, right? When I first started playing, the very first song that I learned was not a Rush song, it was not a Led Zeppelin song, it was not a Pink Floyd song. One of my favorite guitar players, and what I found out recently is that a lot of guys like me who are fairly accomplished always talk about this particular artist in glowing terms because his music was just great. It was accessible. It wasn't really difficult to learn, and it informed the way I played as I began to write my own music. He was a big influence on me. The very first song that I learned to play on guitar, honestly, the first one that I picked up by ear and learned to play was Billy Squier, Everybody Wants You. That riff is like a heart and soul riff for rock and roll. Eddie Van Halen used it. That riff is in a great many songs. You just may not realize it the way that it's played, but it's there. Billy Squier. My first influence as a guitar player was Billy Squier. His that first album, Don't Say No, that changed my view at the time, my early view of guitar. These were songs that I could listen to and learn on my own, right? And I was just so shocked that I picked it up really quickly. He's a great songwriter, but the music is not particularly complicated. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean that as a compliment, the highest compliment. Here's a guy that you could listen to. He's on the radio. He ruled the 80s for a while, right? He's on the early 80s. He just ruled the early 80s. And here was music that you could actually pick up and learn on your own fairly quickly. We didn't have tablature back then. It didn't have YouTube, didn't have video lessons like this. All I had was my ear and a radio, and at the time, a turntable. And I'm buying records one right after the other, trying to learn songs. The first song I ever learned was "Everybody Wants You" by Billy Squier. And then when I realized that a lot of his music, a great deal of it, was actually very accessible to me as a new player. As a new player, it was important to learn every day, right? I I I never really fell into a pattern of playing the same thing over and over again because my musical tastes were so wide, so varied. I listened to everything. I listened to Neil Sedaka and Rush back to back just because I listened to everything. I like music. I love music. Okay? If it touches you, it's a success. And a lot of those early songs I found in later years, as I began to write my own music, I began to hear those influences, those early influences. I hear Billy Squier in my playing sometimes when I'm playing. I hear Rush and I hear Led Zeppelin and I hear David Gilmour. I hear Joe Satriani in my later attempts at writing. I hear those influences. And at first, until you develop your own style, your own thing, you really are just a slave to your influences, okay? And it's not necessarily a bad thing because we all have to start somewhere. And you start with those influences, and as you learn to write and learn to play better, um, uh, uh, you begin to hear those influences creep out in your playing. You're like, wow, I just ripped that off from this guy, or I just borrowed that progression from this guy. And this band, really, this song sounds like this band. And I find that a lot in my own playing. You know what I mean? Um, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's okay to vacation with your influences, but you don't want to live there. You're not going to progress and develop your own style if you're constantly living in someone else's world. It just doesn't work that way. And you need to break out and find your own progressions, find your own abilities, um, but just accept that your influences are going to creep out. Don't get upset about it. Don't think I can't play this riff because it sounds like someone else. Oh, I can't use that melody because it sounds like someone else. There's nothing wrong with borrowing from your heroes. I borrow, well, I steal outright sometimes, but don't be upset about it. Your influences are going to creep out in your playing regardless of what type of music that you're really truly interested in. I grew up in the 80s. I am a slave to that feeling, that sound almost. I am a slave to wanting to achieve that kind of impact, right? The 80s music was just 80s, early 80s up to about 88. Some of the best music ever written and released, ever of all time. And I find that in my own playing. I hear that sometimes in songs that I'm working on. I'm working on one right now that I'm fairly certain I ripped off from. I think it was Def Leppard, but I'm not really sure. This little riff keeps coming back to me. I'm fairly certain I'm ripping that off from Def Leppard. Fairly certain. I don't care though. I like the riff. This little it's got good movement, right? It's implying chords, but at the same time sounds kind of heavy, and it's a great riff. It's a great little hook. So, and I know I'm ripping it off from somebody. It could be um, Iron Maiden. It could be Def Leppard. It could be any number of my influences. It could be Billy Squier for all I know. But the thing is, I'm not gonna trash that riff because it sounds like someone else. I got news for you. I read something many years ago. It was a blog about songwriting, how to develop songwriting skills. I was already well versed in theory, and I understood how to build a song, how to put pieces in sections and build a song. And it said there are really only about 12 songs ever written, rock and roll songs. There are really only about 12. All we're doing is rearranging the chords and adding different words. That's all we're doing. When you accept that, right, you begin to realize that influences, hearing your influences in your playing, are not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing. It means that you learned and incorporated those early influences in your own playing. And when they come out, you don't need to be upset about it. You don't. It's just a natural reflex for us. A lot of my own songwriting is very reminiscent of the 80s, like metal that I used to listen to, the 80s rock that I used to listen to. A lot of my own writing is like that. And I don't necessarily worry about it because I'm writing something that to me is unique, and that I'm putting it in a different order in a way that I think works best. Here's another one. I'm going to tell you afterwards where I got it from, but listen to it and tell me who you think it sounds like. Now, try to think of what that might sound like to you. You may not be as well versed with the. I know where I got that from. I know exactly where I stole that from. But I played it in such a way that I made it a little bit different, and I sort of made it my So the where that came from is literally I stole a Queensryche riff and changed it around. The Queensryche riff goes. Now, one day I'm sitting around. This is many, many years ago. The song that I wrote, that's called "Sundown at the Cecil." You can find that on Spotify and YouTube and all that good stuff. I heard that riff in my head and wanted to do it a little different. So, and I wanted to pay tribute to the '80s at the same time. So it's a little tap harmonic. It's it's so close to the Queensryche song, um, but I changed it around enough to give it a more unique feel, a unique flavor. Um, when I realized that I had ripped off Queensryche, I finished the song. I finished recording the song, drums, bass, guitars, everything. Is before I put a melody on it. It's an instrumental, and before I put the melody on, I'm like, well, I know that riff. There's something about that. I know I stole that from somebody because it's so close to something else. It sounds so familiar, and I didn't know whether it was because I'd been playing the riff for years. I spent so much time recording it. I played that guitar part, I don't know, 100 times recording it. But and then one day I was just kind of sitting around the house and I'm like, I haven't watched. I've got this Queensryche DVD of Operation Mindcrime. And I put in the DVD, and sure enough, there it is. I'm like, holy shit! I stole that from Queensryche. I didn't realize it, but I'd stolen it from. But then I got to listening to my song and thought, you know what? It's just different enough that it's it may not be obvious to anyone else where I got that riff from. And I made peace with it. It was a little difficult at first when when you begin to write your own music. It's a little difficult sometimes to feel good about ripping someone off. At first, it's hard to feel good about it. But when you look at the totality of what you've done with your interpretation, when you look at that, you realize I took that to a different place. I I went a different direction. They went this way, I went this way. So, influences. Don't be afraid to let them sneak out in your playing, in your writing. It's there's nothing wrong with it. We all do it. All of us. You can't listen to anybody. You listen to Led Zeppelin, listen to Jimmy Page, and you will hear Chuck Berry in there. You will hear all the great blues artists from the 50s and the 60s. You will hear them all. He did it his way. I did mine my way. I took a riff that was obviously to me, obviously from someone else, and just took it a different direction. Gave it a different feel, a different flavor. Um, so don't be upset. Influences. It's a nice place to visit. Just don't live there. Okay? You can't grow as a musician, as an artist. You can't grow if you're always going to play the same stuff. Okay? Another huge influence for me was Neil Schon from Journey. In my top five greatest guitar players of all time. The first guitar solo I ever learned was the solo for Who's Crying Now. Picked that up by ear. No tab. Like I said, no tab, no YouTube, no lessons. Picked it out by ear. He was a huge influence in the way he's so melodic when he solos. You can sing his guitar solos because he's so melodic. Yes, he does a ton of shredding in there too, but he gives you these great solos, these great melodic solos. So melodic. You can sing his guitar solos, most of them. Huge. And I adopted, incorporated, always wanting to be able to sing the solo I wanted to play. I always felt that was important. I don't think that's how he does it. He discovers his melodies when he's playing. For me, I kind of went the other direction. I would sing what I thought the melody should be for the solo and then try to play it and add little flourishes in there as I went. He was a huge influence. I don't rip him off in obvious ways, but more in approach. You know what I mean? The way he approaches a solo. He's always so melodic, so pretty. Influences. It's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. Okay? Happy playing, and don't be afraid. Let that stuff that you learned when you first started playing guitar, let that come out. You're good at it for one, right? And for another, it's how you shape your own specific style and tone. Okay? Let that come out. Make peace with it. Enjoy it. Just don't live there. Don't make everything sound like someone else. Take what you've learned and change it. And that's the key to success right there. All right? Peace.